The wind came howling across the frozen pond that January morning, cutting through my coat like it had a personal grudge. Ice cracked underfoot as I walked toward my fishing shack, the same route I'd taken every winter since my father taught me to drill through 8 inches of freeze and wait for perch that might never come. The Coleman lantern I'd left burning overnight cast a yellow glow through the small window, but there were voices inside, 2 of them. I pulled the door open and saw my wife Linda pressed close to Craig Hollister, my best friend of 40 years. They had paperwork spread across the bait table. Through the shack's window, I could see Craig's new F-250 parked on my land, and in the truck bed, a document with my name on it. Linda didn't look ashamed. She looked annoyed that I'd interrupted. The deed in Craig's truck was dated December 14th, the day I'd had a fever of 103. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been flat on my back with the worst flu I'd had in 20 years. Every joint ached. My head felt like someone was using it for an anvil. Linda brought me papers to sign while I was half delirious, said they were tax documents the accountant needed before year end. I signed without reading, because my vision kept doubling and I trusted my wife. Craig had shown up that same afternoon with chicken soup from the diner in town, set it on the nightstand, asked how I was feeling, stayed maybe 10 minutes. At the time, I'd thought it was decent of him. We'd been fishing together since 1984. He was at my father's funeral. I was at his daughter's wedding. You don't question that kind of friendship. Now I understood why he'd come. He wanted to see me sign. The morning after I found them in the shack, I drove to my late brother's house, where his widow Marge still lived. She was 71, a retired CPA with the kind of mind that caught details other people missed. I handed her the quitclaim deed I'd found photocopied in Craig's truck. She put on her reading glasses and studied it for a long time. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something baking, cinnamon maybe. Her cat walked across the table, and she pushed it away without looking up. "Walt," she said finally, her voice careful, "this deed transfers your entire homestead to Linda, not joint ownership, just her, and you have 90 days from the filing date to contest it." "Can I contest it?" "Maybe." She set the paper down, folded her hands. "But you'd need to prove you signed under duress or didn't understand what you were signing. And Walt, this was filed properly, notarized and everything." I was sick. I had a fever of 103. That might work, might not. She picked up the deed again, held it to the light like she was checking for watermarks. "When did Linda start talking about leaving?" "She didn't. I found them together yesterday."
Awesome.
Marge's face went hard, in a way I'd only seen a few times, usually when someone tried to cheat on their taxes and thought she wouldn't notice. "Then this wasn't impulse, Walt. This was planned." The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, snow was starting to fall, the kind of small, dry flakes that meant the cold was settling in for the long haul. "You have 90 days, Marge said again. I drove home, wondering how you fight someone who's been sleeping next to you for 16 years while planning to take everything you own. 2 weeks later, I was at the post office picking up mail when Pete Sanderson from the hardware store came up behind me in line. Pete had run that store for 30 years and knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. "Walt," he said, loud enough that the 3 other people waiting turned to look. "Heard Linda moved in with Craig. That true?" My hands were full of envelopes. I didn't answer. "Shame when a marriage falls apart," Pete continued, like he was doing me a favor by discussing it publicly. "But I guess these things happen." I nodded and left. Outside, the wind was bitter. Road salt crunched under my boots. I sat in my truck with the heater running and opened the mail. The bank statement showed a transfer I hadn't made. $70,000 to something called Brennan Properties, LLC. I'd never heard of it. My hands started shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. I drove straight to Gerald Stokes' law office. Gerald had handled my will and my brother's estate. He was honest, which in a small town sometimes matters more than being brilliant. His office smelled like old carpet and the kind of air freshener they use in funeral homes. He took the deed and the bank statement and spent 20 minutes reading while I sat across from his desk, trying not to think about how the radiator in the corner clanked every 40 seconds. "Walt," he said finally, setting his reading glasses on the desk. "The deed is legal. Linda used her real estate license to file it correctly. The transfer was notarized. And the bank statement shows she had authorization to access your accounts." "I didn't authorize anything." "Did you sign a power of attorney?" I couldn't remember. I'd signed so many things over the years. Tax documents, mortgage refinances. Linda always handled the paperwork because she understood it better. Gerald leaned back in his chair. It squeaked. The LLC was registered 6 months ago with your social security number, which means either you signed something you don't remember or she forged it. That would be fraud, but proving it is harder than you'd think. He picked up a pen, clicked it twice. Walt, I have to be honest with you. Judge Hartman got assigned to your case if you file a motion to contest. And Robert Hartman golfs with Craig every Thursday at the country club. The words landed like a shovel to the chest. So, I've got nothing. You've got 90 days and a judge who's not going to be sympathetic. Gerald's face was tired. He'd been doing this work long enough to know when the game was rigged. I'll file the motion if you want, but I can't promise anything. I left his office and sat in the truck again. Through the windshield, I could see Craig's dealership across the street. New sign up front, Hollister Equipment, expanding spring 2024. 3 new lots, according to the banner. Prime real estate on the highway. That's where my $70,000 had gone. Into Craig's expansion, he'd stolen my home to buy land for tractors. I started the engine. The truck smelled like old coffee and diesel. My phone buzzed. A text from Linda's lawyer. We should discuss settlement terms. This doesn't have to be difficult. Everything was already difficult. I drove home as the sun was setting. The house felt enormous and empty. I made instant coffee because I couldn't be bothered with the pot. Sat at the kitchen table, where Linda and I used to eat breakfast together before she left for showings and I left for the credit union, where I'd worked for 35 years, approving loans for farmers who needed equipment. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my whole career helping people finance their futures, and I couldn't see that my own wife and best friend were financing theirs with my land. The coffee tasted like ash. Outside, it was dark now, the kind of dark you only get in January in Iowa, where the sun sets at 4:30 and the cold makes everything brittle. My phone buzzed again. Another text, this one from Craig. Let's talk. No lawyers. Just us. I set the phone face down on the table. 40 years of friendship, every winter on the ice, every summer at the county fair. His daughter called me Uncle Walt until she was 12, and he'd looked at my land like it was a business opportunity, instead of the place where my father taught me to use a surveying compass. And my brother helped me replace the barn roof after the storm in '03. Judge Hartman golfed with Craig every Thursday. Gerald said I had no chance. Linda's lawyer wanted to discuss settlement. The words sounded civilized. They meant surrender. Marge showed up at my door the next morning with 2 file boxes and a look on her face that reminded me of my brother when he'd made a decision nobody could talk him out of. Your brother would never forgive me if I let this slide, she said, walking past me into the kitchen without waiting for an invitation. We're going to fight. She set the boxes on the table and started pulling out documents. Bank statements, property records, LLC registration forms she'd gotten from the county clerk. The paper smelled like copier toner and old file folders. Linda opened that LLC using your social security number, Marge said, pointing at a registration form. Look at the signature. That's not your handwriting. I leaned closer. The signature was close, but the W was wrong. I always looped it twice. This one only looped once. She forged it. Probably, but proving forgery requires handwriting analysis, and that costs money. Marge pulled out another document. What we need is something simple, something a judge can see without experts. Gerald says Judge Hartman won't be sympathetic. Then we make it so obvious he can't ignore it. She shuffled through more papers. I'm going to keep digging. There's something wrong with this whole thing, Walt. The timing is too perfect. The paperwork is too clean. After she left, I went up to the attic to look for old financial records. The stairs creaked under my weight. The attic smelled like dust and insulation and decades of stored memories nobody wanted to throw away. I found boxes of tax returns, mortgage documents, my father's old business records from when he ran a small surveying operation in the 50s and 60s. I wasn't looking for those, but there they were, leather-bound journals with his precise handwriting, measurements and property boundaries and notes about landmarks that didn't exist anymore. I pulled one out and sat on an old trunk. The pages were yellowed, but the ink was still clear. My father had surveyed half the farms in the county back when people still used chains and compasses instead of GPS and lasers. There was an entry from 1962 about our homestead. Original property boundaries, 40 acres exactly, marked by iron stakes he'd driven into the ground himself at each corner. He'd drawn a map, noting the distance from the old oak tree that lightning had split in '89, the stone foundation of a barn that burned down before I was born. I hadn't thought about these tools in 20 years. After Dad died, I'd boxed everything up and stored it in the attic because I couldn't bear to look at them. I'd gone into banking instead of surveying. Easier work, steadier income. But looking at his handwriting now, I felt something shift. My father had taught me that a surveyor's job isn't just measuring land, it's measuring truth, one chain length at a time. I carried the journal downstairs and set it on the kitchen table next to Marge's file boxes. Outside, crows were calling to each other in the bare trees. The sound was harsh and lonely. My phone buzzed, a text from Linda. "We need to talk about the house. I'm coming by tomorrow to get some things." I didn't respond. That night, I couldn't sleep. I got up at 3 in the morning and went out to my workshop. The building was cold enough that I could see my breath. I turned on the space heater and waited for it to take the edge off. In the back corner, covered with tarps and old paint cans, was my father's surveying equipment. The transit, the chains, the old compass with the brass casing that had turned green in spots. I pulled the tarp off and wiped away 20 years of dust. The transit was still in its wooden case, the lenses protected by leather covers. The brass fittings were tarnished but solid. My father had maintained this equipment like some men maintain classic cars. It was older than me and it still worked. I lifted the transit out of its case. It was heavier than I remembered. The smell of machine oil and old brass brought back memories of following my father across fields in the summer, holding the pole while he sighted through the scope and called out measurements I wrote down in a notebook. He told me once that land doesn't lie. People lie about land, but the land itself is honest. You just have to know how to read it. I set the transit on my workbench and looked at it for a long time. Marge said the paperwork was too clean. Maybe it was. Maybe Linda had gotten sloppy somewhere. Maybe there was a measurement that didn't add up, a boundary that didn't match, a truth buried in the numbers that my father's tools could prove. I didn't know if it would work, but I knew I had to try. Craig showed up at my workshop 3 days later. I heard his truck before I saw it, the diesel engine loud in the quiet morning. He parked next to my old Ford and walked across the gravel like he still had a right to be there. I was cleaning the surveying chains, working oil into the links to loosen decades of rust. The space heater hummed in the corner. The air smelled like kerosene and metal. "Walt," he said from the doorway. I didn't look up. "We need to talk." "No, we don't." He came in anyway, closed the door behind him. He was wearing an expensive jacket, the kind with a dealership logo embroidered on the chest. His boots were new. Everything about him looked polished, successful. "I know you're angry," he said, "but this doesn't have to get ugly. I'm prepared to offer you $10,000 to drop the contest. Walk away clean. No lawyers, no court, no dragging this out." I set down the chain and finally looked at him. His face hadn't changed much. Same lines around the eyes, same gray in his beard. 40 years of friendship, and I was seeing him for the first time. 10,000. It's fair, Walt. More than fair, considering. Considering what? That you stole my home? Nobody stole anything. Linda made a legal decision about property that was in her name. I'm just trying to help you move on. He shifted his weight. You're 68 years old, Walt. How many fights you got left in you? Take the money. Find an apartment in town. Life gets easier. The space heater clicked off. The silence was complete except for the wind outside. I didn't answer. Couldn't trust myself to speak without saying something I couldn't take back. Craig waited another minute, then shook his head like I was being unreasonable. Offer stands for 48 hours. After that, we do this the hard way. He left. His truck sprayed gravel as he pulled away. I stood there looking at my father's surveying equipment, hands shaking, not from fear, from rage that had nowhere to go. The next morning, I went to the courthouse to file my formal contest motion. Gerald had prepared the paperwork, warned me it was a long shot, told me to prepare for disappointment. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old wood. My boots echoed on the marble floors. The clerk behind the counter was a woman I'd gone to school with 40 years ago. She took my paperwork without comment, stamped it, handed me a copy. "Judge Hartman's been assigned," she said. I know. I was walking back to my truck when Deputy Sheriff Tom Garvin caught up with me in the parking lot. Tom was 58, built solid, with the kind of face that didn't give much away. "Walt, hold up." I stopped. Tom looked around like he was checking to see who might be listening. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but Craig Hollister's got liens filed against 3 other properties in the county. Elderly owners, all of them. Same pattern, equipment loans that somehow turned into property transfers." The cold air burned in my lungs. "You're saying I'm not the first. You're just the first one who might actually fight back." Tom pulled his collar up against the wind. "I can't prove anything yet, But I wanted you to know you're not crazy. Something's wrong here. Why are you telling me? Because 20 years ago, you approved my farm loan when every other bank turned me down. Said you believed I was good for it even though the numbers didn't add up on paper. He met my eyes. You saved my family from losing everything. Time to return the favor. He walked away before I could respond. I sat in my truck with the engine running, trying to process what Tom had said. Craig hadn't just betrayed me. He'd been doing this to other people. Elderly farmers who trusted him, who bought equipment from his dealership and somehow ended up signing away their land. My phone rang. It was Marge. I found something, she said. Can you come over? Her kitchen table was covered with documents when I arrived. She'd made coffee, strong and black. The smell filled the small room. Look at this, She pushed a property survey across the table. This is the boundary map Linda filed with the deed transfer. See these measurements? I looked. It showed my 40 acres with boundaries marked in feet and degrees. Now look at this. She put my father's 1962 survey journal next to it. Your father's original measurements. The property line on Linda's survey is off by 60 feet on the eastern boundary. How is that possible? It's not. Not unless someone moved the markers or filed a fraudulent survey. Marge tapped the newer document. And look at the surveyor's signature, James Patterson. I don't know him. You wouldn't. He died in 2022. Marge circled the signature with a red pen. Someone signed a dead man's name to this survey, Walt. That's fraud. Clear, provable fraud. The kitchen was warm, but I felt cold. Linda had used her real estate expertise to create a fake survey. She'd forged a dead surveyor's signature. She'd planned this for months, maybe longer, while sleeping next to me and making breakfast and asking about my day. Will this hold up in court? It should, but with Judge Hartman, Marge trailed off. We need more. Something so obvious he can't ignore it, even if he wants to. What about the handwriting on the LLC registration? That helps, but judges are cautious with handwriting claims. They want experts. She gathered the papers together. Keep looking, Walt. There's more here. I can feel it. They got greedy, and greedy people make mistakes. I drove home as the sun was setting. The sky was orange and purple, beautiful in a way that felt wrong given everything else. Spring was still weeks away, but you could feel it coming in the air. The snow was starting to melt in patches. Mud season would come soon, that time between winter and spring when everything turns to muck, and you can't get tractors through the fields. That night, I pulled out all the documents Linda had brought me over the years. Tax forms, insurance papers, the mortgage refinance from 3 years ago. I went through every signature, comparing them to papers I knew I'd signed myself. Most matched. But 3 didn't, the LLC registration. A power of attorney I didn't remember signing. And a quitclaim deed dated December 14th, the day I'd had a fever of 103. The handwriting was close. Close enough that I might not have noticed if I wasn't looking. But the W was wrong on all 3. Single loop instead of double. I set them aside in a folder. Evidence. Maybe not enough, but something. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Drop the case, or this gets worse for you. You've been warned. I stared at it for a long time. Then I forwarded it to Tom Garvin and went to bed. Sleep didn't come. I lay there listening to the house settle, the wind in the eaves, the distant sound of ice breaking up on the pond. This house had been in my family since 1947. My father built the workshop, my brother helped me replace the roof. Every nail and board held a memory, and Craig thought I'd walk away for $10,000. He didn't know me at all. 40 years of friendship, and he'd never understood that some things aren't for sale. That dignity matters more than money. That a man's word and a man's land are the only things worth fighting for when everything else is gone. I got up at dawn and went back to the workshop. The surveying equipment was laid out on the workbench. I picked up the compass, felt the weight of it in my hand. The brass was cold and smooth. My father had taught me how to use this. How to sight a line and measure truth. It was time to measure some truth of my own. Reverend Dale Matthews showed up on Sunday afternoon without calling first. I was in the kitchen, going through more paperwork, when I heard his car pull up. He was 63, silver-haired, with the kind of gentle manner that made people trust him with their worst secrets. "Walt," he said when I opened the door. "Got a minute?" I let him in. The house was warm. I'd been running the furnace higher than necessary, trying to fight off the cold that seemed to come from inside more than out. Dale sat at the kitchen table without being asked. He had a way of making himself comfortable that put people at ease. It was probably what made him good at his job. "I've been hearing things," he said, "about you and Linda. About Craig. I'm sure you have. Pete Sanderson's been busy. I'm not here to gossip." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm here because I care about you, about your marriage, about healing." I poured him coffee I didn't think he wanted and sat across from him. "Linda came to see me," Dale continued. "She's hurting too, Walt. She says things got complicated, that the marriage had been struggling for a long time. She wants to try counseling, see if you two can work through this." The words hung there like smoke. She wants counseling. She does. And Craig feels terrible about his part in this. He thinks maybe if you all sat down together, you could find a path forward that doesn't destroy decades of friendship. I set my coffee down carefully. "Dale, Linda stole my home. Craig helped her, and now they want me to sit in a room and talk about feelings? I know it seems. She forged documents, used a dead man's signature on a property survey, took $70,000 from my account without permission." I pulled out the ice fishing permit from my wallet and slid it across the table. "Linda told her lawyer I was drunk and violent the night of December 20th. Said she was scared of me, but look at this. My annual fishing permit. Time-stamped and dated December 20th at 6 in the morning. I was alone on the pond. I was there until dark. There are photos on my phone of the perch I caught." Dale picked up the permit and studied it. "She lied," I said. "To her lawyer, to you, probably. She's not hurting. She's covering her tracks. Walt, I'm not interested in reconciliation with someone who planned my destruction while sleeping next to me for 16 years. I took the permit back. "And I'm not interested in forgiving Craig for looking at my land like it was a business opportunity instead of remembering all the times we fished together on that pond." Dale was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a cardinal was singing, bright red against the gray branches, the first one I'd heard this year. "I understand you're angry," he said finally. "But bitterness will eat you alive, Walt. I've seen it happen. Good men consumed by rage because they couldn't let go. This isn't about letting go. It's about refusing to be erased. What does that mean? It means I'll forgive when truth matters more than peace." He left after that. Didn't push. Just told me he'd pray for me and that his door was always open. I watched him drive away and felt more alone than I had in months. 2 days later, Marge showed up again, this time with 3 file boxes instead of 2. "I've been working on this nonstop," she said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. Tax returns, bank statements, property records going back 5 years. "And I found something." She pulled out Linda's LLC registration again, then set another document next to it. "This is Craig's dealership incorporation papers. Filed 6 months before Linda's LLC. And look at this, same lawyer filed both, same notary signature." So they were planning this together. For at least 6 months, maybe longer. She shuffled through more papers. But here's the interesting part. Linda's LLC shows an initial capital contribution of $75,000. Your $70,000 plus 5 from somewhere else. From Craig. That's what I thought. So I pulled Craig's dealership financials from the public filings. He reported a major equipment sale in November. $75,000 to an LLC called Brennan Properties. Marge looked at me over her reading glasses. "He sold equipment to Linda's company, equipment that probably doesn't exist. It's money laundering, Walt. They're hiding assets." The kitchen smelled like coffee and the lavender hand lotion Marge always wore. The radiator clanked in the corner. "Will this help in court?" "It should. It shows premeditation, conspiracy, and it gives Judge Hartman something concrete to look at even if he doesn't want to." She circled the dates on both documents. "But Walt, I need to tell you something. Your brother would have figured this out in a day. I've been at it for weeks. I'm not as sharp as I used to be. You're sharp enough. He would have been proud of you, fighting like this." Her voice softened. "He always said you were tougher than you looked, that you had more steel in you than people realized." I hadn't been to my brother's grave since the funeral 3 years ago. Couldn't face it. Couldn't stand there and admit I'd let his widow grieve alone while I was busy believing my life was fine. "I should have visited more," I said. "You're here now. That's what matters." Marge gathered the papers back into neat stacks. "And we're going to finish this for him, for you, For every old farmer Craig thought he could cheat because we're too tired to fight back. After she left, I sat at the table, looking at the evidence she'd compiled. The pattern was clear now. Craig and Linda had planned this for months. The affair was just part of it, a way to justify why Linda would leave. The real goal was always the money. My land, the equity I'd spent 30 years building. They'd looked at me and seen opportunity, seen someone trusting and old and in the way. They'd made a mistake. I went to the hardware store the next morning for screws, needed to fix the workshop door that had been sticking since January. Pete Sanderson was behind the counter like always, reading the local paper. "Morning, Walt," he said, but his voice was different, cooler. "Morning." I found what I needed and brought it to the counter. Pete rang it up slowly, like he was thinking about what to say. "Heard you're still fighting the divorce," he said finally. "Taking Linda to court." "It's not a divorce, it's fraud." "That's one way to see it." He bagged the screws. "Other way is that sometimes marriages end, and we have to accept it, move on instead of making everyone uncomfortable." The store smelled like paint thinner and cut lumber. 2 other customers were browsing the aisles, but I could tell they were listening. "She forged documents, Pete. Stole $70,000. "That's what you say, but I've known Linda for 15 years. She's always been honest in her business dealings. Maybe you're just bitter about losing her to a younger situation." He slid the bag across the counter. "No offense, Walt, but some men our age can't accept when they're not enough anymore." The words landed like a punch. I paid cash and turned to leave. That's when I saw Josh Brennan standing by the door. He was 28, ran a small organic farm east of town. I'd approved his equipment loan 8 years ago when he was just starting out. Every other bank had turned him down because the numbers didn't pencil out and he had no collateral. "Brennan," Josh said, then louder so Pete could hear, "I wanted to thank you again for that loan, for believing in me when nobody else would. You've done well with it." "I have. Paid it off last year, bought 20 more acres this spring." He looked past me at Pete. "And I'll tell you something. Walt Brennan's words saved my family when we had nothing. He approved that loan on a handshake and faith, so when I hear people talking about his character, I remember that." The store went quiet. Josh looked at Pete directly now. "What's your word worth, Pete?" He walked out. I followed. Outside, the sun was warmer than it had been, still cold, but you could feel March trying to push winter aside. Mud season was coming. The parking lot had patches of ice mixed with puddles. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "Yes, I did." Josh unlocked his truck. "My grandfather always said you judge a man by what he does when nobody's watching. You helped me when I was nobody. That means something." He drove off, and I stood there feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not quite hope, but not despair either. That evening, Jessica Rourke from First Prairie Bank called my cell phone. "Mr. Brennan? It's Jessica, from the bank. I remember you." She was the young teller who'd always been polite. 26, maybe. Always asked about my day, instead of just processing transactions. "I need to talk to you, but not on the phone. Can you meet me somewhere?" "When?" "Now. The library parking lot. I get off in 20 minutes. She hung up before I could ask questions. I drove to the library and waited. The sun was setting, painting everything orange and purple. Jessica pulled up in a small Honda and looked around before getting into my truck. "I could lose my job for this," she said. She had an envelope in her hands, manila and thin. "But what they did to you isn't right." "What who did?" "Your wife and Mr. Hollister." She opened the envelope and pulled out printed documents, bank statements, transaction logs. I'm not supposed to access customer accounts unless there's a direct inquiry, but I was processing some commercial deposits for Hollister equipment, and I noticed something. She showed me the first page, a transfer log from December 14th, $70,000 from my account to Brennan Properties, LLC. I already knew about this. "Look at the IP address." She pointed at a string of numbers at the bottom. "That's where the transfer was initiated. It's not a residential address. It's commercial." "I don't understand." I looked it up. That IP address belongs to Hollister Equipment's main office. Your wife initiated the transfer from Mr. Hollister's dealership on his computer network. The truck cab felt smaller suddenly. I could hear her breathing, nervous and quick. "They did this together," I said. "That's what it looks like. And there's more." She pulled out another page. Pulled out, "Mr. Hollister has been making regular transfers to your wife's LLC since August. $5,000 a month, always on the first." Before she even left me. "Yes, sir." Jessica folded the papers and put them back in the envelope. I could get fired for this. The bank manager already reprimanded me last week for talking to customers too much. But my grandfather lived in a nursing home his last 2 years. He used to tell me about men like you, men who kept their word even when it cost them. She handed me the envelope. Make it count, Mr. Brennan, please. She got out and drove away before I could thank her properly. I sat in the library parking lot as darkness fell completely, looking at the documents she'd risked her career to give me. The evidence was clear now. Linda and Craig had been planning this since August at least, maybe longer. The affair, the LLC, the forged surveys, the $70,000 transfer, all of it coordinated from Craig's office. They'd thought they were smart, thought they'd covered their tracks, but they'd gotten greedy and careless. Used Craig's computer network because it was convenient, made regular payments because they thought nobody would notice, forged a dead surveyor's signature because they thought nobody would check. My phone buzzed. A text from Marge. Judge Hartman recused himself. Reverend Dale preached about integrity last Sunday. The whole town was there, including Hartman's wife. He couldn't stay on the case after that. I read the message 3 times. A new judge, a real chance, evidence that showed premeditation and conspiracy. For the first time since I'd opened that ice shack door in January, I felt something close to hope. I drove home through darkness. The stars were out, cold and bright and distant, the kind of night where you could see the Milky Way if you looked up long enough. Inside, I spread Jessica's documents on the kitchen table next to Marge's files and my father's surveying journal. The pieces were all there now. The timeline, the motive, the proof. I pulled out my father's old surveying compass and set it in the middle of everything, brass and glass and truth. Tomorrow, I'd take all of this to Gerald. We'd file new motions, bring in the evidence about the IP addresses and the forged signature and the 6 months of planning. But tonight, I just sat at my kitchen table and let myself feel something I hadn't felt in months. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I believed I might win. The next morning dawned gray and cold, but the snow was gone. Just mud now, thick and dark, covering everything. The kind of mud that gets into boot treads and takes hours to dry. Spring was trying to break through, but winter wasn't giving up easy. I drove out to Oakdale Cemetery for the first time in 3 years. The roads were wet, potholes full of water that splashed against the undercarriage. The cemetery sat on a hill east of town, surrounded by bare trees that would leaf out in another month. My brother's grave was in the newer section, under an oak that was probably 100 years old. The stone was simple. Thomas Brennan, beloved husband, 1956-2021. Marge had picked it out, and I'd paid for it, but I hadn't been back since the funeral. The ground was soft under my boots, mud mixed with old grass. I stood there for a long time, not knowing what to say. Finally, I just said it. I'm sorry I haven't visited. I'm sorry I left Marge alone with all of this. The words felt inadequate. You'd know what to do right now. You always knew. The wind moved through the oak branches. A crow called somewhere distant. Linda and Craig stole the homestead, or they tried to. Remember when we replaced that roof in '03? You said this place was worth keeping. That family land means something. I crouched down and pulled some weeds that had grown around the base of the stone. I'm fighting for it. Marge is helping. I think you'd be proud of her. She's tougher than both of us combined. I heard footsteps behind me. Marge was walking up the hill, carrying flowers, yellow daffodils, early bloomers that meant spring was real this time. I saw your truck, she said. Should have come sooner. You're here now. She set the flowers in the built-in vase at the base of the stone. Tom knew you loved him, Walt. He told me once that you were the most loyal person he'd ever known, that you'd never abandon anyone who needed you. But I abandoned you. No, you were dealing with your own grief. We all handle it differently. She touched the gravestone gently. But he's right about one thing. You don't abandon people. That's why you're fighting, because walking away would mean abandoning everything this place represents. We stood there together in the mud, in the cold March wind. The daffodils were bright yellow against the gray stone, a small piece of color in a landscape that was still mostly brown and dormant. He knew you loved him, Marge said again. Now, prove you love the land he helped you keep. I drove home feeling lighter somehow, like I'd put down weight I'd been carrying without knowing it. That afternoon, I went out to the workshop. The space heater was running, the air smelled like kerosene and old wood. My father's surveying equipment was still laid out on the workbench where I'd been cleaning it. I picked up the transit and carried it outside. The ground was soft, but not impossible. I set up the tripod near the eastern property line, where Linda's survey showed a boundary 60 feet different from my father's measurements. It took me an hour to remember how to level the instrument properly. My father had taught me when I was 15, but that was 53 years ago. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but the mechanics came back. Sight the level, adjust the screws, lock it down. I called Marge and asked her to hold the ranging rod while I took measurements. She drove over and stood in the mud without complaining, holding the pole straight while I sighted through the scope. "What are we doing?" she asked. "Looking for the original property markers, iron stakes my father drove into the ground in 1962. It took 2 hours, but we found the first one. 3 feet down, right where my father's journal said it would be. Exactly 60 feet from where Linda's survey claimed the boundary was. I pulled it out of the mud. Iron stake, 2 feet long, corroded but solid. My father had stamped his initials into the top. W.B. Walter Brennan Sr. "This is proof," Marge said. "This is proof." We found the second stake an hour later, and the third one after that. All of them exactly where my father's 1962 survey said they'd be. All of them proving that Linda's boundary map was fraudulent. I cleaned the stakes and photographed them next to my father's journal pages. Documented everything. Measurements, GPS coordinates, the initials stamped into the iron. The sun was setting when we finished. The sky was that particular shade of gray-blue you get in early spring when the days are getting longer, but the warmth hasn't arrived yet. "Your father would be proud," Marge said. "He'd probably say I should have checked this weeks ago. He'd say you checked when you were ready." She loaded the surveying equipment back into my truck. "Now we have everything we need: the forged signature, the IP addresses, the fraudulent survey, and physical proof that Linda lied about the boundaries." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father teaching me to use that transit, about my brother helping me replace the roof, about every memory tied to this land and this house and this life I'd built over 68 years. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something outside. A truck engine. I looked out the window and saw headlights in my driveway. I went to the door and found my old dog Roscoe lying on the porch. He was 15, had been with me since Linda and I first moved to the homestead. He'd been sleeping more lately, moving slower. I'd known his time was coming. He looked up at me with cloudy eyes and thumped his tail once. Then he laid his head down and stopped breathing. I sat on the porch with him for a long time. The night was cold but not bitter. The stars were out. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the pond ice breaking up. Spring sounds, the sound of things ending and things beginning. Roscoe had been there through everything, through my father's funeral and my brother's funeral and Linda leaving and Craig's betrayal. He'd growled at Craig that day in January, the only time I'd ever seen him act aggressive toward someone. Even the dog had known something was wrong. I buried him at dawn near the oak tree where he used to sleep in summer. The ground was soft enough to dig. The work warmed me. When I finished, I stood there with mud on my boots and my hands and felt something break loose in my chest. Everything was ending. The marriage, the friendship, the dog, the winter. But endings make room for beginnings. That's what spring teaches you, that death and life are part of the same cycle, that you can't have new growth without old things falling away. I went inside and washed my hands, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with all the evidence spread out in front of me. Tomorrow, Gerald would file the new motions. We'd present the forged signature, the IP addresses, the fraudulent survey, the iron stakes that proved Linda had lied. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But tonight, I'd buried my dog and visited my brother's grave and found the truth buried in the mud. Tonight was enough. The courthouse hearing was scheduled for the third Wednesday in May. Gerald filed all the new evidence 2 weeks prior: the forged surveyor's signature, Jessica's banking records showing the IP address from Craig's dealership, the iron stakes proving Linda's boundary survey was fraudulent, Marge's forensic accounting showing 6 months of planning. The new judge was Sarah Klein, 62, appointed from the state capitol. She had a reputation for being thorough and unsympathetic to people who wasted her time. I wore the same suit I'd worn to my brother's funeral. It smelled like mothballs from being stored too long. Gerald met me outside the courtroom at 8 in the morning. The halls smelled like floor wax and coffee from the vending machine near the bathrooms. Linda's lawyer is going to argue that the surveying errors were honest mistakes, Gerald said, that the boundary confusion was due to old records being unclear. They'll say the IP address means nothing because Linda had access to Craig's office for legitimate business purposes. What about the forged signature? That's our strongest point. Hard to explain signing a dead man's name. He adjusted his tie. But Walt, Even with everything we have, this could go either way. Judge Klein is fair, but she follows the letter of the law. If there's any technical reason to dismiss, I understand. Marge arrived with 3 file boxes. She'd organized everything with tabs and highlighted sections. She wore a navy blue suit and carried herself like someone who'd spent 40 years making numbers tell the truth. Ready? She asked. As I'll ever be. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling and fluorescent lights and that particular silence that comes from people waiting for justice to be decided by strangers. Linda sat at the defendant's table with her lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit. Craig wasn't there. Gerald had said he'd been advised not to attend. Linda looked different, thinner, her hair was shorter. She didn't look at me when I sat down. Judge Klein entered and everyone stood. She was tall, gray-haired, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She sat and gestured for everyone else to do the same. This is a motion to void a quit-claim deed based on allegations of fraud, she said, reading from the file in front of her. Mr. Stokes, you may begin. Gerald stood and laid out our case, the forged quit-claim deed signed while I was incapacitated with fever, the LLC registered using my social security number without my knowledge, the property survey with a dead surveyor's signature, the banking records showing transfers initiated from Craig Hollister's business location. He was methodical and clear, no drama, just facts presented in order. Linda's lawyer objected 3 times. Judge Klein sustained 1, overruled 2, then Marge took the stand. She testified about the handwriting analysis she'd done on the LLC registration, about the suspicious timing of the transfers, about the fraudulent survey signature. She spoke clearly and precisely, the way someone does when they've spent a lifetime making complex numbers understandable. Mrs. Chen, Linda's lawyer said during cross-examination, isn't it true that you're Mr. Brennan's sister-in-law, that you have a personal interest in this case? I do have a personal interest, Marge said. I'm interested in the truth, and the truth is that your client forged documents and stole property from a man who trusted her. Objection, non-responsive. Sustained. Mrs. Chen, please answer the question asked. Yes, I'm his sister-in-law. That doesn't make the evidence less real. Linda's lawyer tried to poke holes in the surveying evidence, argued that old property markers could have shifted over 60 years, that measurements from 1962 might not be reliable, that Linda had relied on a professional survey in good faith. Your Honor, Gerald said, standing, we have the actual iron stakes marked with Walter Brennan Sr.'s initials. We have his original survey notes, and we have a signature on the new survey from a man who died in 2022. That's not a good faith error. That's fraud. Judge Klein leaned forward. Ms. Morrison, can you explain how your client obtained a survey signed by a deceased surveyor? Linda's lawyer shuffled papers. Your Honor, my client relied on documents provided by her real estate office. She had no knowledge that the signature was, who provided the documents? Silence. Ms. Morrison? I don't have that information at this time, Your Honor. Judge Klein made a note. Continue. The hearing lasted 4 hours. By the end, everyone was exhausted. Judge Klein called a 15-minute recess and disappeared into her chambers. I stood in the hallway with Gerald and Marge. Through the windows, I could see the spring sun warming the courthouse lawn. The trees were fully green now. Lilacs were blooming somewhere nearby. I could smell them even through the closed windows. How do you think it went? I asked Gerald. Better than I expected, but I've been surprised before. Marge squeezed my arm. Whatever happens, we fought. That matters. We filed back in when the bailiff called us. Judge Klein returned with a thick folder and her reading glasses on. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, she said, and I've reviewed the original deed filing and the supporting documents. Based on what I've seen, I'm issuing the following orders. She looked directly at Linda. First, the quit-claim deed dated December 14th is hereby voided. Mr. Brennan has demonstrated sufficient evidence that he was incapacitated at the time of signing and that the document was obtained through fraud. I felt Marge grab my hand. Second, the property survey submitted with the deed transfer contains a forged signature and fraudulent boundary measurements. I'm referring this matter to the county prosecutor for investigation. Linda's face went white. Third, the financial transfers made from Mr. Brennan's accounts to Brennan Properties, LLC were conducted without proper authorization. Mrs. Brennan is ordered to return the full amount of $70,000 plus interest within 30 days. Judge Klein set down her glasses. I'm also ordering a full audit of Brennan Properties, LLC and its relationship with Hollister Equipment. If criminal charges are warranted, the prosecutor's office will handle that separately. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down. It was over. I sat there not quite believing it. Gerald was shaking my hand. Marge was crying. Linda was arguing with her lawyer in heated whispers. We walked out into the May sunshine. The air was warm. Flowers were blooming in the planters outside the courthouse. The world looked different somehow, brighter. "You did it," Marge said. "We did it." My phone rang. It was Tom Garvin. "Walt, you need to know something. FBI agents just raided Hollister Equipment, federal fraud investigation. They're going through everything." "When?" "About an hour ago. I'm looking at it right now. They're carrying out boxes of records." He paused. "I think your case triggered something bigger. They found 3 other property owners Craig defrauded the same way, all elderly, all through equipment loans that somehow became property transfers." I leaned against my truck, suddenly dizzy. "Walt, you there?" "I'm here." "They're going to want to talk to you, the FBI, about your case. Your evidence probably just put Craig away for federal time." Damn. I hung up and told Gerald and Marge what Tom had said. "Federal charges," Gerald said. "That's serious. Craig's looking at years, not months." "Good," Marge said quietly. "He deserves it." I drove home alone. The windows down, warm air blowing through the cab. The fields were green now. Corn was up, soybeans planted. Everything that had been frozen and dead in January was alive again. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw a note taped to the front door, handwritten, from Jessica at the bank. "Mr. Brennan, heard you won. I'm so glad. My manager found out I gave you those documents. I've been fired, but I don't regret it. Some things matter more than keeping your head down. Thank you for teaching me that. Jessica." I stood on my porch, holding that note for a long time. She was 26 years old. She'd risked everything to help an old man she barely knew, and she'd lost her job for it. I went inside and called the credit union where I'd worked for 35 years. Asked to speak to the regional manager. Told him I knew a young banker with integrity and courage who'd just become available. Gave him Jessica's name and number. It was the least I could do. The annual Memorial Day Tractor Parade was scheduled for the last Saturday in May. It had been a Clarkson tradition for 40 years, started by the Equipment Dealers Association as a way to show off vintage tractors and bring the community together. Craig's dealership had always sponsored it, his banner hanging at the front of the parade route, his newest models on display. This year, his banner was gone. I hadn't planned on going. Parades weren't my thing, and I'd spent enough time being the center of attention in this town. But Josh Brennan called me Thursday evening. "Mr. Brennan, I'm organizing the parade this year. The association asked me to take over since Craig's situation." He paused. "I'd be honored if you'd drive your father's John Deere. Lead the whole thing. It would mean a lot." "Josh, I don't think. People need to see you, sir. Need to see that doing the right thing matters. That standing up to people like Craig matters." His voice was earnest. "Please. It would mean something." I thought about it for a long time after he hung up. My father's John Deere was a 1958 Model 520, restored over years of weekend work. It sat in my barn under a tarp, cleaned and maintained but rarely driven. My father had bought it new, used it to farm our 40 acres until he couldn't farm anymore. Friday morning, I pulled the tarp off and checked the engine. The barn smelled like motor oil and old hay. The tractor was green and yellow, the paint still bright from the restoration work my brother and I had done before he died. We'd replaced the seat, rebuilt the carburetor, repainted every surface. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, coughed once, then settled into a steady rumble that shook the barn walls. I let it warm up while I cleaned the windows and checked the tires. Saturday dawned clear and warm, real spring weather, the kind of day where you could work outside without a jacket and feel the sun on your back like a promise that winter was truly over. The parade started at 10 in the morning from the high school parking lot. I drove the John Deere slowly through town, the engine loud but steady. People lined the streets, families with children, older folks in lawn chairs. Pete Sanderson from the hardware store stood on the corner, and when I passed, he nodded. Just once. But it was something. Behind me came 20 other tractors, vintage models and new ones. Josh drove his father's old Farmall, the young organic farmer on a modern case, retired farmers on international harvesters that had been in their families for generations. The route took us down Main Street, past the shops and businesses, past First Prairie Bank, where Jessica used to work before they fired her, past Craig's dealership, which had a closed pending investigation sign on the door, and empty lots where tractors used to sit. The space where Craig's banner had hung for 4 decades was just empty air now. At the end of the parade route, the tractors parked in a field near the fairgrounds. People wandered among them, looking at the old equipment, talking to the farmers. Josh had set up a small stage with a microphone. I want to thank everyone who participated today, he said, his voice carrying across the field. This parade has always been about community, about remembering where we came from and honoring the people who built this town with hard work and honest dealing. He paused and looked directly at me. This year, we're especially grateful to Walter Brennan, who reminded us all what integrity looks like, who showed us that doing the right thing matters even when it's hard, even when it costs you. People started clapping, not everyone. Some looked uncomfortable. Some probably thought I should have just walked away and let Linda and Craig have what they wanted. But enough people clapped that it felt real. I didn't make a speech, didn't want to, just nodded and shook hands with the people who came by to look at my father's tractor and tell me stories about the old days when he'd surveyed their farms or helped them with a loan. Around noon, I drove the John Deere home. The engine ran smooth, the sun was warm, the fields were green. Everything that had been frozen and dead in January was alive now. Marge was waiting on my porch when I got there. She had papers in her hand. Linda's lawyer called. They're not contesting the judge's order. The $70,000 will be returned by next Friday. She sat down on the porch steps. And I got a call from Tom Garvin. Craig was arraigned yesterday on federal fraud charges, 4 counts. He's looking at 15 to 20 years. I sat next to her. The porch boards were warm from the sun. Does it feel like winning? She asked. It feels like the end of something. Not sure winning is the right word. Your brother used to say that justice isn't about feeling good. It's about things being set right, even when it doesn't fix what was broken. We sat there for a while without talking. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the field. The sound was clear and bright, the kind of sound that makes you remember why spring matters. What will you do now? Marge asked. I don't know. Stay here. Keep the place up. Maybe teach someone else how to use these old surveying tools before the knowledge is gone. And the homestead? I've been thinking about that for days. The house was too big for one person. The land needed someone young enough to work it properly. I had no children, no one to pass it to, except my nephew Daniel, my brother's son. I think I'll deed it to Daniel, I said. Keep the workshop and the pond for myself, but give him the rest. Let him build something here the way Dad did, the way Tom and I tried to. Marge smiled. Tom would love that. 2 weeks later, I sat at my kitchen table with Daniel and a lawyer and signed over the deed. Daniel was 28, married, with a little girl who was 3. He wanted to farm organically, grow vegetables for the farmer's market, maybe start a small CSA program. You're sure about this? He asked. I'm sure. This land needs someone who'll care for it. Build something on it, you'll do that. What about you? I'll keep the workshop and my access to the pond. That's all I need. I handed him the deed. Your father and I built something here worth keeping. Now you do the same. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset over fields that weren't mine anymore but still felt like home. The air was warm. Lightning bugs were starting to come out, blinking in the grass. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear Daniel's little girl laughing. The money Linda returned was sitting in my account. $70,000 plus interest. I didn't need it. Didn't want it, really. It felt tainted, earned through lies and betrayal. I called the regional manager at the credit union the next morning. I want to establish a loan fund, I said, for young farmers who need equipment but can't qualify for traditional financing. $75,000, administered through the credit union, named after my brother. That's generous, Walt. It's justice. Craig stole this money to buy equipment he didn't need. Seems right to use it to help farmers who actually need it. Jessica Rourke got hired by the credit union 3 days later. Called me to say thank you. Said she'd be administering the loan fund I'd established, that she'd make sure it went to people who deserved it. You taught me something, Mr. Brennan, she said. That courage matters. That standing up costs something, but sitting down costs more. You taught me something too, I said. That young people still understand what integrity means. That got me through more than you know. Summer came on strong. The corn grew tall. Daniel planted tomatoes and peppers and built a farm stand near the road. His little girl played in the yard where my brother and I used to play 60 years ago. I spent most of my time in the workshop, cleaning tools and organizing files and teaching Daniel how to use the old surveying equipment. He was interested in learning, said you never know when skills like that might matter. Some evenings I'd walk down to the pond and sit in the fishing shack, the same shack where I'd found Linda and Craig that January morning. I'd cleaned it out since then, repaired the door, replaced the bait table. The memories were still there, but they'd lost their power to hurt. I learned 3 things that year, First, that trust isn't weakness, but verify anyway. Second, that legacy isn't what you own, but what you protect for others. And third, that justice is slow and often hollow, but still worth fighting for because surrender costs more than any battle ever could. Next winter, I'd be back on the ice, drilling through the freeze, waiting for perch that might never come. But I'd be there, still trying, still fighting, still refusing to let winter have the last word. That'll do. The following January, I returned to the pond on opening day of ice fishing season. The wind was sharp, but not cruel. The ice was solid, 8 inches at least. I drilled my hole with the old hand auger, the spiral blades biting through the freeze the same way they had for 40 years. I set up my gear in the shack and poured coffee from a thermos. The steam rose and disappeared. Through the small window, I could see Daniel's farmhouse in the distance, smoke coming from the chimney. His daughter was building a snowman in the yard, her red coat bright against the white. The line went into the water, and I waited. That's what ice fishing is mostly. Waiting. Sitting in the cold and hoping for something alive below the surface, hoping the patience pays off. Some men my age sit around waiting to die. I've got fish to catch and a workshop to clean and a nephew to teach, surveying to before spring planning starts. I've got Marge coming over for Sunday dinner and young Jessica calling sometimes to ask advice about the loan applications she's reviewing. The line pulled taut, something down there. I set the hook and reeled it in slow. A perch, maybe 9 inches, not big but honest, real. I held it for a moment before letting it go. Watched it disappear back into the dark water. The ice will melt in a few months. The mud will come, then the green. The cycle keeps turning whether you're ready or not. All you can do is show up, keep drilling, keep waiting, keep fighting for the things that matter, even when the cold tries to tell you it's not worth it. I'm 79 now. The land isn't mine anymore, but I still protect it. The workshop still smells like my father's tools. The compass still points north. That'll do.